Hello everyone, welcome back. In this lesson, I'm going to share my proven routine for finding the best funding rate arbitrage opportunities by using a free online tool called coinglass.com. After this lesson, you should be able to identify profitable arbitrage opportunities all by yourself. Before we begin, let's quickly revise the idea of the funding rate. A funding rate is the mechanism exchanges use to keep the futures price close to the spot price. It's calculated automatically based on the balance between buyers and sellers on each exchange. Because every exchange has a different mix of traders, the funding rate can vary from one platform to another. This difference creates the chance for net positive funding rates over a period of time. Some coins will show a larger net funding rate than others. And since we already neutralize price movements through the delta neutral strategy, we don't need to do any price prediction or technical analysis. Generally, we want to select the coins with the highest net funding rate. However, the coin with the highest funding rate at one single moment is not necessarily the best choice. What really matters is the consistency of that net funding rate over time. That's why we use an online tool like CoinGlass to check the history, the persistence, and the stability of the funding rate. With this information, we can make a safer and much more reliable decision about which coin to arbitrage. Okay, if you're comfortable with the funding rate concept, we can now move on to coinglass.com. CoinGlass is a very comprehensive website for crypto derivatives data. It tracks funding rates, open interest, liquidation data, long-short ratios, and many other useful market indicators. For our purpose, we are mainly interested in the funding rate history. First of all, go to the top menu and click on funding rate. This page shows you the current funding rate across major exchanges for almost every coin. But our main goal is to analyze the history because consistency is far more important than a single reading. Now, scroll down to the middle of the page and you will see the funding rate history chart. On the left side, make sure to select USDT, then choose current rate, and finally select the coin you want to analyze. For our first example, let's look at Bitcoin, or BTC. Since I have accounts with both exchanges we use for arbitrage, Bitunix and MEXC, I just select those two from the list. You can select another pair if needed. Now place your mouse cursor on the last bar of the chart. At this moment, you will see that Bitunix is showing a funding rate of 0.0067%, while MEXC is showing 0.0045%. Remember, this is not the finalized funding rate. The funding rate will continue to change right up until the exact settlement time, which in this example is 8 o'clock. All the times shown on CoinGlass are based on GMT 0, so make sure you keep the time zone in mind when you're checking the charts. If you want to see the previous finalized funding rate, click on the second last bar. You'll notice that Bitunix was at 0.0081% and MEXC was at 0.0060%. So at midnight, the net funding rate was 0.0021%. If you short on Bitunix and long on MEXC, let's look at another example. Check the data for the 29th of October, 2025 at 4 p.m. At that time, Bitunix was showing 0.0056%, while MEXC was at negative 0.0084%. That creates a net funding rate of 0.014%, which is extremely attractive for arbitrage. Take your time and explore different days and times. Now, here's a question for you. Do you notice any interesting relationship between the funding rates of these two exchanges? All right, pause this video for a few minutes and try to inspect the chart by yourself. Okay, let's get back to our lesson. In the last section, we reviewed the funding rate history chart on coinglass.com, and you should have already spent some time exploring the data yourself. So, how was it? Were you able to notice any interesting patterns or relationships between the funding rates of these two exchanges? Let me share my own observation with you. When we look at the funding rate history over a longer period, for example, from August to November, something very interesting appears. The net funding rate stays consistently positive, or at worst, close to zero. There are almost no negative funding cycles in this entire time period. What does this mean? It means that if you had been shorting on Bitunix and longing on MEXC, you would have earned positive funding rate income for almost 3 months straight without interruption. In other words, most of the time you're earning, sometimes you simply earn nothing. You just wasted your time for that funding cycle, and only on very rare occasions would you experience a loss, but in total, you still win by sitting here. And that leads to my personal theory. Please pay attention to it. When the net funding rate between a pair of exchanges stays positive over a long period, it usually continues to stay positive in the future unless there is a major change in the types of traders participating on those exchanges. On the hand, if the net funding rate between a pair of exchanges stays negative over a long period, it usually continues to stay negative in the future unless there is a major change in the types of traders participating on those exchanges. In other words, when we see a strong positive trend in the net funding rate, it often continues to stay positive. And this is exactly the kind of pattern we want when choosing a good funding rate arbitrage pair. Let's look at another example so you can understand my theory even better. This time, switch the chart to a coin called XLM, which is actually one of my favorite arbitrage coins. You'll notice something interesting. From the 26th of September until the 11th of October, 2025, the net funding rate stays almost exactly at zero. There's no gain, but also no loss. However, after the 11th of October, at 8 o'clock in the morning, the net funding rate suddenly turns positive, and not just a little bit. It jumps above 0.1%, and what's more important is the consistency. From the 11th of October all the way until the 4th of November, this positive funding pattern continues. Then again, starting from the 10th of November, the positive funding rate appears once more. And unless something major changes, we can reasonably expect that this positive trend will keep going. Here's an analogy that might help you visualize this pattern. Think of it like an earthquake. When a place experiences a major earthquake, there is a high chance that aftershocks will follow in the same area. Funding rate behavior is similar. When we see a strong positive funding pattern, there is a high probability that it will continue for a while. And when we see a long period of zero funding rate, that pattern also tends to repeat in the future. So once you understand this behavior, you have a real winning edge. For positive funding rates, if they have stayed positive for a period of time, they usually tend to continue. Even if it stopped for some days, they usually will appear that pattern again in the future. For zero funding rates, if the coin has shown zero funding before, it will likely show zero funding again in the future. For negative funding rates, if the coins has shown negative funding for a period of time, they usually tend to continue. So I never choose these kind of coins. All of this holds true unless there is a massive shift in the trader behavior or the trader composition on those exchanges. In conclusion, here are the criteria I use to identify a truly golden funding rate arbitrage coin. First, there should be a clear history of strong positive net funding rates. Ideally, one exchange consistently shows positive funding while the other shows negative funding. And this pattern should persist over a meaningful period of time, such as 1 month. Second, during the periods when the funding rate is not positive, the net funding rate should stay at zero. Zero means no gain, but also no loss, which is perfectly acceptable for a stable arbitrage setup. And third, negative net funding cycles should be rare. A good arbitrage pair should spend most of its time either earning or staying neutral, and only very rarely dipping into negative territory. If a coin meets all three of these criteria, it becomes a strong candidate for a reliable, long-term funding rate arbitrage strategy. Now, let me tell you some of my favorite coins. They are XLM, XRP, XCN, SEI. Pause the video and check these 4 coins. Are they matched with my criteria? Can you try to find out other coins meet this criteria as well? Okay, let's get back to our lesson. You might be wondering, is there a faster way to spot good arbitrage coins instead of checking each one manually? And the answer is yes, there is a much quicker method. On the CoinGlass website, there's a very useful tab called Accumulated Funding Rate. This page shows you the total funding rate accumulated over a chosen period of time, and it compares the data across different exchanges. It's like seeing the whole month's behavior in one single list, so it becomes much easier to identify strong patterns right away. Here's how I use it. First, I usually set the period to 30 days. A 1-month window gives us a meaningful trend while avoiding noise from short-term fluctuations. Next, I select only the two exchanges we use for arbitrage, MEXC and Bitunix. This makes the chart clean and extremely easy to read without unnecessary information from other exchanges. After that, I sort the list by the highest accumulated funding rate on Bitunix. This immediately shows me which coins generate the most positive funding on Bitunix over the past month. Then I check the same coin on MEXC. If the MEXC accumulated funding rate is negative, that means the coin has the largest net funding rate difference between the two exchanges. And that difference, positive on one side, negative on the other, is exactly what we want for a golden funding rate arbitrage opportunity. So with just a few clicks, you can instantly identify which coins have the strongest and most consistent net funding rate over the past 30 days. Let's go through some examples together so you can see how this selection process works in real situations. First, take a look at the coin called Hippo. On Bitunix, the accumulated funding rate over 30 days is quite high, about 3.7%. At first glance, that looks good. But when we compare it with MEXC, we can see that the funding rate there is almost the same. This means that if I short on Bitunix and long on MEXC, the funding rate simply cancels out. So even after 30 days, I would earn nothing from this pair. This example shows why we must always check both exchanges. Now let's look at another coin, Como. Here, the numbers look a bit better. Bitunix shows around 2.8%, while MEXC is around negative 1.57%. That gives us a net funding rate of roughly 1.2% over 30 days. This is better, but let's keep searching to see if we can find something even stronger. Now scroll down the page and click Show All so we can see the complete list. Notice that the green numbers indicate negative accumulated funding. This makes it much easier for us to spot potential arbitrage opportunities. Here, we find a coin called SEI. The total net funding rate is around 3.5%, which is already quite good. And then we see another coin, ATH, showing a net funding rate of roughly 4.3%, which is even better. So now we have two candidates, SEI and ATH. Which one should we choose? To decide, we need to check their historical funding rate charts. This helps us understand the consistency of the pattern, not just the accumulated number. I recommend opening a new browser tab so you can compare quickly. When I check the history, I would personally choose ATH because Bitunix is consistently positive and MEXC is consistently negative over an extended period of time. Both sides remain strong over time, not suddenly high for one day and then flat the next. This is exactly what we want. Now let me show you a counterexample. Look at this coin called EVAA. It shows a high funding rate, around 0.5%, which looks attractive at first glance. But when we examine the historical chart, we see that the funding pattern is not consistent. It spikes sometimes, but then drops back to zero. It does not follow our theory of stable, repeating behavior. So even though the funding rate looks high, this coin is actually not a good choice. This is why consistency is crucial. We don't just want one lucky spike. We want a steady, reliable pattern that aligns with our strategy. Let's look at one of my favorite examples. If you check the funding rate history for XCN, you'll notice something very special. From the 26th of June to the 23rd of July, the net funding rate stays around 0.09%. And here's the most important part. XCN is a coin that settles every 4 hours, not every 8 hours like most other coins. That means we don't get 3 cycles per day. We get 6 cycles per day. So when you multiply 0.09% by 6 funding cycles, you get 0.54% per day. That is incredibly high for a delta neutral strategy. This is a coin we should always keep an eye on. Whenever XCN shows a similar pattern in the future, it becomes a strong candidate to set up another arbitrage strategy. In conclusion, funding rate arbitrage is not a strategy that wins every single cycle. There will be times when you earn nothing, and that's completely normal. But in terms of the effort required and the consistency of results, it absolutely outperforms normal crypto trading. I'm not saying you should only do funding rate arbitrage, but I strongly recommend including it as one of your long-term investment tools. If you've tried crypto trading before, you probably know how difficult it is to win consistently. The emotional stress, the volatility, the constant decision-making, it can be exhausting. Funding rate arbitrage, on the other hand, is the strategy for the lazy person. It doesn't require predicting price direction, it doesn't need constant monitoring, and it doesn't rely on luck. Once you set it up properly, it becomes one of the easiest, most stable ways to generate steady returns in the crypto market. Now that you fully understand the nature of funding rates, you should remember one important rule. Your list of profitable coins will change from month to month. Funding rate patterns evolve as different traders come and go, so you should always update your selection regularly. So take some time today to explore coinglass.com and check which coins you personally like based on consistency and history. Take 5 coins you like most for your homework. In the next lesson, I'll talk about how many coins you actually need to set up your funding rate arbitrage, and I'll also share my personal experience on managing multiple pairs effectively. All right, that's all for now. See you in the next lesson.